Good afternoon. Welcome to the Aldrich. I'm Richard Klein, Exhibitions Director, and this lecture or discussion this afternoon is noteworthy that it's the first of a series of lectures generously funded by the Harry Zarin Fund. Mr. Zarin is here. Thank you. I just wanted to answer a couple of basic questions about this show. Some of you have seen the show already, some of you haven't. But the three questions: why this show at this institution at this point in time? And the origins of this show go back to right after 9/11 and a trip I made to Europe, a vacation trip, had nothing to do with the art world. And being abroad, really for the first time in my life, when people constantly asked me what it felt like to be an American. And I was unprepared for that and answering that question. And as most Americans, I've never really thought too much about being an American. I'm not patriotic in any traditional way. I acknowledge the fact I'm an American, but what does it really mean to be an American? And looking at that question in light of history, and independent of my interest in contemporary art, being interested in American history, and particularly history of New England. And I've lived most of my life in New England, and if you are interested in New England history, you come back to the critical story of European colonization of New England as being such a defining moment in this history's past. The other thing is that this exhibition was created in a social environment and a political environment, the state of Connecticut. And when one thinks of Native American art or history, one generally thinks of west of the Mississippi, many people, and particularly outside the United States. The landscape of Connecticut in the last 25 years has been the site of a remarkable series of developments. Number one, the resurgence of the Pequot people from near extinction in the 1960s, and most recently, the Shagdakoke tribal nation. And those of you who don't live around here, the Shagdakoke are a tribe that have a reservation in Kent, Connecticut, about 30 minutes north of here, who have been trying to get federal recognition. And the political background of this struggle over the past several years. I believe that, yes, indeed, art is global and international now, but I'm a believer in thinking globally and acting locally. And to organize a show like this in New England, in the Northeast, and in the East, puts a particular spin on the subject matter. The artists involved in the project, however, are from all over the United States. And, but it is being presented in a specific environment, which is New England. The panel this afternoon will be moderated by Paul Chaat Smith, who is a Comanche writer, curator, and critic who lives in Washington, D.C. He's the co-author of Like a Hurricane, the Indian movement from Alcatraz to Wounded Knee. He has contributed numerous essays on art and cultural politics over the years. He joined the staff of the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian in 2001, where his curatorial projects have included the permanent history exhibit at the museum on the National Mall in Washington, and James Luna's remarkable exhibition at the 2005 Venice Biennale. Paul is involved in this project on two levels, here today, but also as a significant contributor to the catalog. And I'm happy to report that we have the catalog in-house, and I'm very pleased with the outcome. When we have a project here at the museum where we're inviting artists to come and do new work, it's very hard to have a publication available for the opening. This exhibition opened, had a soft opening in August, and that time delay between the opening in August and today gave us the opportunity to actually produce a catalog that accurately represents the work in the show. And it's at the front desk, and it's I'm very proud of it. Also, one of the contributors was Fergus Bordewick, who I'm not sure if Fergus is here at the panel today, but he will be here this afternoon. And he, if you're aware of Fergus's work, he recently wrote the best-selling book about the history of the Underground Railroad. He lives in the Hudson Valley, but he was brought into this project because of his long-term interest in the subject matter and really writing about it from the standpoint of history, not from art. So I encourage you to take a look at the catalog. Thank you so much, and I'm going to, Paul is not just the only moderator. I will moderate the panel this afternoon also, and at the end there will be a question and answer period.
Thanks. Last spring, Richard Klein called me up and talked to me about this show. And I never heard of Richard before. I never heard of the Aldrich before. And so what he was presenting sounded somewhat interesting, Indian and non-Indian artists. There's an ongoing discussion in the Indian contemporary art world about sort of why artists have higher profile in the contemporary art world. And a lot of issues about that. So he was going to come down. He came down in June. He was going to be in D.C. anyway, so we had lunch. And before he came, I had decided not to write for the catalog. I had too many things going on. I just was trying to cut back. And I even had Truman Lowe actually prepare me the reasons to say no. Why I was part of this. And the reason I changed my mind is because when Richard presented the work of the artists of the show, I wasn't impressed. I was actually jealous. So my only way to get in was to write. So that's why I'm here, sort of against my will a little bit. I've been very pleased to have been persuaded to be part of this project. I think this is going to be regarded as one of the one or two most influential shows in Indian contemporary art in 2006, precisely because of the framing of it, because it includes Indian and non-Indian artists, and it has non-Indian artists taking on topics about Indian history, Indian culture, American history. And so I think that's a provocative idea for the show. A show some of you may be familiar with called Holy Land. It's done by the Art Museum, a very different show, but also including Indian and non-Indian artists. So I think a lot of people are watching this closely, and I think the opportunity this afternoon is to hear from the artists and talk about their engagement with the show and the work. So I came up with 8 questions. Richard and I did actually. So I'm going to start with a general question. Asking artists to talk about how are you and your work connected to the Northeast? What is your opinion of this as a framing device for no reservations? Let's start with Matthew.
Yeah, I think that's, for me, it is an important question because of the work that I'm presenting in this exhibition looks at.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, I can't hear anything. People try to speak up just to drop.
Yeah, is that better?
Thank you very much.
That question in itself is actually, I could say that is the framework for the project that I worked on, Ameican History, Everything Has a Name. The project grew out of an invitation to think about the Hudson River Valley as a site or as a place, and I was intrigued with the difficulty of doing that, the implication of thinking of an entire river valley as one place, and what that could mean, or why that, what kind of motivation or desire could be behind this question. And for me, the draw was to reconsider New York City and New York State, and particularly the Hudson River Valley, as through its colonial history, to think of it in light of its beginnings as a colonial entity under those names of New York, and before New Amsterdam and New Holland and New Netherlands. So I think what I was hoping to achieve by doing that would be to ask again the question of the extension of colonial history, of looking at post-colonial questions in light of colonial history, and to think of the post-colonial period beginning at the beginning of colonization rather than only in the more recent history, and think about the domestic questions in light of colonial history and the colonial present.
Okay, my connection to the Northeast of Connecticut is actually sort of simple. I grew up not very far away from here in a town called Canton, Connecticut, and which I guess is about 25 miles to the northeast of here, maybe a little bit further. And it was a small rural place, not unlike Ridgefield. And so as a child, up until I was 14 years old, I grew up in the woods. So this has always been sort of part of my background. Another part of it also is that I'm a painter, and I've been, for the last probably almost 10 years, I've been doing landscapes. And so my artwork has just been about, painting trees and mountains and stuff like that. What was interesting, and I guess the reason why I was invited to be part of the show, was I take what is apparently a non-political or apolitical genre of painting, landscape painting, particularly romantic painting from the 19th century, and politicize it and put it in a context of American history and particularly racism, because most of my work has dealt with racism, whether it was about Africans or about Native Americans, and how they fit into this landscape. And so that's basically the starting point for my work for this show. Should I continue? Okay. Well, I didn't know.
Only if it's interesting.
Okay. So, just to finish up, something a little bit more specific to this thing was, growing up in Connecticut, we were constantly surrounded by native names. Where I grew up in Canton, Connecticut, there were quite a few of them. One of them was Neepog, another one was Weetog. And so we grew up with all these names all around us and never knew what they meant, although all we knew is that they were Native American names. And so when Richard actually, almost 2 years ago, contacted me about doing this project, it really sparked my interest, because it gave me the motivation to begin the research to find out what these words meant. And so part of this project has been going to research libraries, in part through the Smithsonian, and also through the Mashantucket Indian Reservation out in eastern Connecticut, to do the research in these Algonquian languages to find out what these places mean. And so part of that also is this translation of these words, and coming out of that is one big burning question. And the question is, why did the British who settled this part of North America retain as many native names as they did, albeit in anglicized form, yet at the same time did everything they could to actually exterminate the natives? So they killed the people and kept all these names. And that was how, when I actually started painting specifically for this project, which would have been back in January, that was the question that ran through my head. The names are here, but the language is gone, the people are gone, and trying to figure out what this lost language, these lost words meant.
So. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? My name is Duane Slick, and Paul, could you read the question again?
Yeah, we just would like to talk about how you and your work are connected to the Northeast, and how you think of that as a framing device for the show, being about sort of this region.
Okay. Originally, I'm from the state of Iowa. My father is from the Squaxin Nation, and my mother's from the Winnebago or Ho-Chunk Nation in Nebraska. And so I'm not actually from the Northeast, but I live in Rhode Island. And years ago I was, I guess the way I wanted to kind of frame it was with the book that's in the show. It's called Looking for a Roscoe. It's a coyote story. And I've always been interested in coyote stories or trickster stories. And what had happened was I was at a residency in Provincetown, Massachusetts. I was supported by that residency for about 2 years after graduate school. And I went back. I was teaching at the Institute of American Indian Arts in '93, and I went back to hang out with all my artist friends in P-Town. And I ran into somebody, some guy kept saying hello to me and couldn't figure out why. And at the time my hair was about down to my in the middle of my back. You know, I was the only guy that looked very native. And it turns out that this gentleman was he discovered that he was 1/4 Lakota Sioux. And at the time, in the early 90s, and then he'd also discovered his HIV status, which was positive. And at the time, to receive such an evaluation, everybody pretty much thought it was just a death sentence. And so what he had done was he sold his software companies, plural, and moved to Washington. And I didn't know all of this stuff. I didn't know who he was. But it turns out he was active with I guess ACT UP, one of the founders of ACT UP. And his mother had told him that he was 1/4 Lakota Sioux. So he wanted to find out more about this. This was something that he didn't know. So we talked, and he sort of like I didn't know anything about him. He didn't know anything about me, about the depth of my involvement as an artist with my medium. But we started talking and hanging out, and became very. What he had done was he was very wealthy, and he rented a nice house, and it was constantly filled with activists, AIDS activists, people who founded a drugstore, making drugs accessible to people living with AIDS, and hanging out with them was an education. So I wanted to do something to kind of work with that. And so the result was this book that's here in the show, Looking for a Roscoe. Because in that, I'm interested in the idea that the past is always in the present. And I'm also interested in the idea, from my experiences working at the Institute of American Indian Arts, with the idea of the viability of traditions. Because a lot of times it seems like identity issues, as they relate to traditions, a lot of people feel like this is this sort of static thing, and I just do not believe that. So in the book, I kind of blend a lot of different things. There's like dream sequences. There's a joke that my father. It's actually it is a true story. When my father was in the diner in Tama, Iowa, the waitress refused to serve him and told him and his cousin, "We don't serve Indians." And my dad said his cousin got up and yelled at her and said, "We don't want Indians." But, we want cheeseburgers. I guess I'm just interested in some of the kind of storytelling. One of the other, there's so much of our reality, you know, as a Native person, our realities, we don't realize the depth that we've been, you know, impacted by so many different things. A friend of mine, Gail Tremblay, at a conference. I was walking into the conference. I was late, running into a symposium, and the second I stepped in the door, I heard her announcing that at the time, this was a while ago, that the average life expectancy of a Native American male is 45. And I remember thinking about that, wondering, you know, how true is that today? But at the same time, you know, I also realized that, you know, that these kinds of realities are, you know, are present. On my mother's side of the family, for instance, she came from a family of 10 children, 8 brothers, and by the time I was 24, there was 1 left, and all of them had hit that peak of 45 and then died from various causes. But you know, I like the idea of, you know, with this book, it's the idea of blending the trickster tale with some of the realities of living in Indian country. So I'll just leave it at that.
So my Northeast connection is Seneca. My mom grew up on the Cattaraugus Reservation in upstate New York. And my father's family, my father's actually from Wyoming, and his family homesteaded land there, and they were both ranchers and educators, strange mix maybe. And you know, it's interesting. I don't think you really start thinking sometimes about your identity until you leave home. But one of the things so when I left home and went to college, I started to think more about my experience having grown up actually in the Northwest, having had a dad who was an engineer at Boeing, and a mom who went from being a nurse to working in Indian education for 27 years. And I remembered that when I was younger, like in kindergarten, I had told my teacher that I thought I was half cowboy and half Indian. and I really remember like sitting at my father's like knee, and, you know, I don't know, it's like had his Rainier beer and just like watching John Wayne pictures on TV and kind of like struggling with like which side are you sort of rooting for? Because I of course sort of thought I had some origins in both. And it's really changed. I mean, actually, Duane was a teacher of mine in Santa Fe. I kind of took a very strange route through school. I went to liberal arts college, graduated, realized that it really didn't address a lot of values that I had. And so I went to the Institute of American Indian Arts, where I met Duane and other teachers and students. And so I guess my work has sort of been trying to understand where I come from. And I guess I'll just keep it at that.
Okay, for this next question, actually 2 questions. Whoever wants to answer it can answer it. If no one does, then I'll choose something. If you like the show, describe why or why not. In what ways is No Reservations unique? Have you previously been part of other thematic exhibitions that include Native and non-Native artists? And were they successful? I think Duane wants to answer that.
To some degree, I can agree with, I guess, that notion that a lot of Native artists don't want to participate in shows that are completely Native, for fear of some form of ghettoization. That's generally the argument. I've participated in a lot of shows, Native shows. The first one was the first show I ever participated in was organized by Jean C. Smith. And it was called the Submolic Show in response to the Columbus woes. In that sense, it was Moloch was Columbus spelled backwards. But the idea was that they wanted to organize a show that's completely, everything was done by Native people, down from the grant writing to curation, the shipping. I don't know how far they went to who made their stamps. But it was. That was an interesting show. But at the same time, there was kind of a respectful distance in relationship to how that show was organized. If I were to, how would I characterize this show different or unique from the others? I guess I'm thinking of someone like James Luna, who in 1992 at another CAA panel I attended, he said in 1992 everybody needs an Indian. He said everyone needs an Indian for their mascots. Everyone needs an Indian for their street names. And then he said that he refused to participate in these types of shows because because the market and the attention span of this country was fickle. And the other problem was that everybody wanted one piece by everybody. So you would go to these shows and there'd be like 30 artists with one piece, and everything is like competing and fighting for some sort of attention, or in fact, trying to make some sort of soundbite. And so, how does this show? I guess how do we distinguish this show from those? I think one of the things is, there's another type of respectful distance, in the sense that there's 10 artists, and so in a sense, like seeing Jeffrey's work, it's getting a sense of how that work can actually breathe, and getting a sense of the depth of his research, and that type of, I guess I'd call it that type of respect, I think, deserves some recognition.
Yeah, I'll say, George, I think what's very interesting and successful for me about the show is that it asks the question of how the theme, which has been defined, how it functions or can function in the contemporary art discourse, in the context of contemporary art and visual experience. And I think that's the most important distinction in a way that the show makes. That it puts very particular questions within a general context that I think can also be critically extended to the art context itself. The show can ask questions about other exhibitions and the broader context.
I really like being part of the show. I guess I like the conversation. I like that it's happening I feel like I've been introduced to new work actually that I haven't seen before, but I also think that the work kind of speaks to each other in an interesting way. And I remember when I graduated, and actually I think if you go to school in Santa Fe, actually, there's such a kind of particular aesthetic down there. There's a lot of things happening, but especially for contemporary Native artists, there's a particular aesthetic that I think is a little bit more commercially oriented, and it's not the only thing down there. There's a lot of great things. But I remember kind of wondering, what I did want, once I got out of going to school there. And it's interesting, there's an artist, T.C. Cannon, and a bunch of other artists who were really active in the 60s. And I think that one of the things that they had, there's a quote that was, I'm an artist who happens to be Indian, but their identity was always very present in their work. And I actually feel like, well, I don't separate those two things. And in fact, I think it's even a complicated thing when I kind of jokingly tell you that I'm part cowboy and part Indian. It's like I don't actually see that division at all within the person that I am. Like my nativeness is just like a piece of me. You don't divide or cut off apart. And one of the things that I've found in participating in both types of shows, and I feel lucky that I've been able to do that, but I have found a tremendous amount of support within the Native community in terms of just like the network of working with other Native artists and curators. And I think that from National Museum of American Indian, or whether it's the Institute of American Indian Arts Museum, I think that those institutions and the people that I've met through them, or even a person like John, who's just really an advocate and a mentor to younger artists, I think that they've made a great difference in the artists that I'm growing to be.
Well, this is the first time I've ever been in a show that was specifically about Native American issues. I've been in a lot of group shows that were theme-based, but never, this is the first time for Native Americans issues, so I can't really base it on past experiences, but this particular experience is very refreshing for me, mostly because I like the work in the show. I think it does talk to each other. And it's refreshing also because having lived in New York City now for 14 years and dealing with the art world there, it's really nice to be able to come here, see an exhibit with people from other places other than New York City that are politically minded, and I don't have to deal with the New York City art world.
Yeah, well, one thing I wanted to say is that starting this process, the idea was not to have 5 native and 5 non-native artists. I knew that the number of artists in the show was going to be limited because I wanted to give people really a lot of space. But that kind of ended up being, in some ways, almost an accident at the end of realizing I kept on cutting the list down and then coming up with 5 native and 5 non-native artists. That parity was not intended from the beginning at all. The other thing was that this show could have been done a number of different ways. I mean, the form it's taken that you see here at the museum now, it could have been done 100 different ways. At one point, there were about 35 artists on the table that were under consideration for the project. And in working with the subject matter, I have to say that it's clearly the curatorial project I've done in the over 15 years that I've been working professionally that is the most complicated thing I've ever worked on. And usually when you work on a group thematic show, you're anticipating some sort of resolution, that you're presenting a thesis and you're kind of answering that thesis. This subject matter is so complicated, there's no answers, easy answers. In some ways, I think a show like this raises more questions, and that's the thing that's, I think, the strength of it. But in working, the artists that ended up being involved in this, it really, it ended up being that I wanted people who had come of age since the initial native rights movement, and also kind of a geographical spread of people, of getting people from all over the United States, and also working with some artists whose work I respected, that I was aware of working with the subject matter. And there's a lot of interesting work going on out there right now dealing with this, a lot of it. And it was fascinating to me. The more I looked into this, really, the more names that came up, and especially younger artists under 30 years old. Really significant work going on out there, and that's my main regret, really, is not being able to include some of the interesting work that I found.
You consider yourself an American. Why or why not?
Sorry. This is a sticky question. I would say that I am an American for many reasons by default. I was born here, and so I am an American by birth. I have an American passport. But given my life experience and my politics and what I've learned, I don't feel like an American. I don't feel very proud to be an American. So.
Can I ask a question, please? What is an American?
We left it open-ended, right? In a sense, he was talking as a U.S. citizen.
Yeah, I was talking about a U.S. citizen of European descent.
Like Matthew.
Yeah, it is a difficult question to answer because it's a question of identification and the way that one sees oneself, where one finds oneself. I would have a similar answer. I think it would, for me, it is a process of thinking about what I am not and of the positions that I agree to work within or find myself in. But I think there is also an interesting confusion, a useful confusion between the terms citizen and American, or U.S. citizen and American as well, to reconsider what is America or the Americas, which I think has been so much more examined and to our advantage has become much more of a question over the last 10 years. For me, really, since 1992, and a lot of the interesting work that happened around that as well.
I first thought a couple things. I remember seeing reproductions from Alfredo, it's pronounced Jar or Yar, his Times Square piece where he showed the United States. It said, I can't remember the order of the text, that said, "This is not America." And then it showed the entire continent, Canada down to the United States and then Central America. And said, "This is America." The other thing I immediately thought of also was another early 90s image was the concept of mixed blessings. The idea that to have an identity within this country for some groups is sort of a condition of mixed blessings. As I was speaking about some of the background, behind the scenes information, anecdotal information about my book, I think that as being sort of a condition of mixed blessings. Because, in a way, it's, to have a native identity. I also have a friend, I always tease her, she's a Seminole, and I always say, I remember seeing you walking across the land bridge. Carrying a bag of hummus. I forgot where I was going.
Any other Americans up here? No? Okay. As a subject matter, the landscape is a consistent thread through American art. Since land is central to the theme of the exhibition, how is the American landscape, both physical and political,
manifested in your work?
How's the landscape manifested in my work? Well, one of the things, when I started working with blankets, I first started with this really simple interest in the idea that in our community, blankets are given away to witness somebody for an important life event. So it's as important to give away a blanket as it is it's as significant to give away a blanket to somebody as it is to receive one. And then I was just also very interested in how there's a history of trade with blankets, and then how there are also these objects that we have in our possession, and they're objects that we take for granted, that they're sort of full of story. So I guess, like, in regards to the way it relates to the landscape, I mean, the settling of the West happened with trade, and it also sort of was accompanied by the decimation of landscape or many communities that lived along it. And I guess that's one aspect of my work.
Well, I just question. I know, it's just reiterating what I said before. I mean, I'm a landscape painter, so everything I do somehow touches upon landscape. And I don't know if I said this before, but one of the things that interests me about depiction of landscape, whether it's painting or photography, is the sort of and I know this might sound kind of, at this point, kind of overdone or talked about, but the inherent lie of the image, that the image doesn't tell the truth. And just because, for example, that it's photographic means that it's a representation of reality of what's actually happening. And certainly that goes for painting, but also what happens outside the frame. Because if you look at the picture, the painting as a snapshot, what's actually happening above, below, and all around. So I approach these pictures like that, what's actually happening outside of that frame. So, which is why my work ties in all this history and politics to it.
Both projects that are included in this exhibition revolve around that question. The timeline piece concerning the history of the Black Hills and also the project that I mentioned before about the Hudson Valley. I guess in a way I was trying two different strategies for looking at familiar landscapes or even terrain which we know perhaps very much as pictures, as already framed. And in the case of Matthew Buckingham Hudson project, I tried to think about ways that cartography, mapping, and storytelling, narrating were perhaps at odds with each other and represented two different ways potentially for attempting to control landscape or to instruct land to speak in particular ways. And then my attempt was to go back to the lesser known colonial history, and particularly the economy between the Dutch and Lenape, and to think about that system that briefly existed, which was so disastrous, and to reanimate the landscape in those terms. And similarly with the Black Hills, Pasapa, Mount Rushmore, and the Six Grandfathers, to think about even just simply the terms that are used around this so-called shrine or memorial to democracy, and what kind of narrative is so violently inscribed on the land through the construction of the presidential portraits of Mount Rushmore, and to try to look at landscape for these actually not surprising paradoxes that really constitute places like Mount Rushmore, to think about why it is or isn't surprising that the sculptor Gutzon Borglum had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan before he carved Mount Rushmore, and to go into these much more particular and detailed questions that could be found under such a general and over-familiar image as Mount Rushmore.
So true.
Yes, it's true.
Oh, now it's right up my alley. It's kind of stuff like
Yes.
finding all the dirt out.
We're gonna make sure there's plenty of time for questions from the audience. So and there's one last question in which the entrants are organized by race, much like the last episodes of Survivor, where people are cut in teams, something in a white team and a red team. Just kind of 19th century racialism. We thought we needed some of that. Okay, so for the white team, you are a non-native artist who makes work about Indian history and culture. Why? Do you think this will change how others view your career? And if so, how? Then for the red team, you are a native artist who participates in all-Indian group shows. Some native artists have stopped doing so, believing the all-Indian group show is a tired format that ghettoizes them. What's your view? Let's start with the white team.
I don't know if I can address the team question, but the question, I think, for me, it's actually for me, it's the unavoidability of these questions. While of course it is a choice within the work that I'm doing, I guess a wider framework of choices that I have made about the work itself. I also believe in this inseparable connection of past and present, and looking at actually some of the things that Richard was saying at the beginning about the origins of the idea of the show, the sort of trying to address some of the very pervasive questions that have been there for such a long time that were refocused a few years ago, and just finding myself recognizing the inevitability of needing to address and ask further questions about these subjects, and to see the connections where they are less obvious and have been neglected. I don't know if that answers the
What's this question again, real quick?
Well, speaking for the white nation,
Yeah.
Why do you make work about Indian history and culture? We've talked about that some. But do you think this will change how others view you or your career?
No.
Okay.
No. Period. No. No. And basically, he said everything that I would say, and I just do it because I do it, and it's not going to alter anything in my career, actually.
Okay. Marie?
Well, I want to participate in all types of shows. You don't have to be red or white. It could be pink and everything else. But yeah, I guess I'm all about pink. But one thing that's really fascinating to me, though, is I can say that I think Well, I think I'm pretty much being true to myself and the work I need to make, and that's always going to be sort of my main motivation, is being honest to myself in that way. But I do think that there is a little more, and I would be curious if this happens for Team White, I do think that sometimes that in the gallery world, like there's some coaching that goes on. Oh, watch out! Like that, you don't get too put into this one camp. And that's a real part of my work, and or a real experience, I guess. And I guess I feel like I've always held my ground, but I also feel like I've always had to prove myself. I mean, even just to actually have to answer that question to somebody, if they could sort of, I'm regretful about that situation.
Let's see.
You spoke to some of this earlier.
Yeah. I remember I have friends. She's African American. She refuses to go to the show, and the show just says black artists or African American artists or African American women. The whole idea of I guess it's what they call the hyphenated other. I guess I remember, thinking about all of that, and of course, just wanting shows. Obviously, you got to start somewhere. And at the same time, I remember reading a quote by Jimmy Durham, just stating that an artist, who, in looking at work made by an artist who's Native American, if the political and social realities are not at the center of the discussion, there's any other kinds of, or any kind of discussion that does not take those issues into consideration, any kind of discussion that happens on Native art that does not recognize some of the political and social realities, any discussion about Native art that does not take those into consideration is obscene. And I just remember, just sort of like thinking, well, what happens in my work? And how do I kind of, I've always wanted to engage with some of those issues to a degree. And so for me, it doesn't bother me. It's like the idea, it's like, my art. I like the idea that the art seeks a form, and that at the same time, other types of group shows, it can hold its own. But at the same time, it's like, to some degree, it's also an honor. The network. It's like when I talk to a lot of Native artists, anywhere in the country, it's like everybody seems to know each other. And that's just something that, knowing that there's other people out there and that there are these forums, I think that's been very important, and to a lot of other younger artists too.
One thing I wanted to add to that is just working on this project, kind of an awareness of the commodification of Indian art in a very particular way. I mean, in the art world, obviously there are people, collectors who are interested only in photography. But working on this project, I became aware of collectors who were interested primarily in Native American art, and some of these collectors were not Native. In fact, an interesting situation several weeks ago of having a visitor come to the museum who was an art collector who said one of the first things out of their mouth was, well, who are the Native artists in the show? Because they came to see the show because they wanted to see the Native art in the show, not the other art. And I didn't know how really to respond to that, but clearly this idea that if you're functioning in the larger art world, the art world of making a living and selling and showing your work, that there's a particular market for Native art that drives this huge kind of world that is part of the art world and overlaps with it, but at the same time is kind of parallel to the art world, much the same way that the world of photography is kind of this world unto itself, but does overlap with the art world proper. And I just become very, very aware since the show has been open with visitors coming to the museum. And that's one conscious decision we made in terms of the wall labels, is that, you know, we don't kind of state the tribe or the people of the artist first thing on the label. And I, from going to see a lot of Native shows over the course of the last several years, is being very aware of categorizing people immediately of via signage and exhibitions. And, you know, we had a kind of a brief internal debate here at the museum about, you know, would we put Peter Edlund as being a Swedish American on the wall label, for instance? It's a complicated issue that the expectations of people in terms of what they want to see and what they expect a native artist to do or a non-native artist to do. And I think that was one of the filters really for making work in the show, was to get away from stereotyped expectations of what kind of work an artist should be doing, and maybe blur those boundaries a little bit. We have some time for some questions from the audience. So.
Hi, my name is Kathleen Ashton.